Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy today to have Professor Julia Fischer from University of Göttingen and the German Primate Center. Julia obtained her PhD from the Free University of Berlin, and afterwards had postdoctoral positions at the NIH, Harvard University, and University of Pennsylvania. Afterwards, she returned to Germany at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. She also did field research on wild baboons in Botswana. Afterwards, she became a professor at the University of Göttingen, where she has a joint appointment with the German Primate Center, and she is currently heading the cognitive ethology laboratory. And her research centers around vocal communication and social cognitions in non-human primates. We are very happy today to have you, Julia, and looking forward for your talk.
Well, first of all, thank you. This is really great. I very much appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate everyone's time they're taking to be here with me today and listen to what I've got to say about monkey communication and what the studies of non-human primate vocal communication reveal, or may not reveal, about the evolution of speech. Before I start, I have to acknowledge a couple of key people that played a big role in the research I'm doing and that helped me also to do the actual research. So first of all, Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seifert. I was a postdoc with them at Penn and working on the baboons, the Chakma baboons in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. So they greatly influenced my thinking, and I hold them dearly also as friends. Dorothy passed away, as most of you will know, unfortunately 2 years ago, but you know, she will forever influence what I'm thinking. Then there is Kurt Hammerschmidt here. I don't know if you can see the mouse. Kurt Hammerschmidt. I worked with him forever since I got my master's. He retired this year officially, but unofficially, I hope he's further on board studying monkey communication and the vocal communication of other species as well. Then there is Tabitha Price here. She was a PhD student in our group, and she contributed significantly to the research I'm presenting today. And then finally, Franziska Wegdell, who was a master's student in our group. And she is now a PhD student in Zurich. And so thanks to these people and many more, and also, of course, the funders that allowed us to do this research in the first place. So, many of us who are studying monkey or ape communication, non-human primate communication, are interested in trying to understand the origins of speech. And so when you do this, then you first have to deconstruct what language in the broader sense, or a spoken language, so speech really is. So which components make up the language faculty, and which ones of these components are uniquely human, and which ones are shared with other species. So basically, when it's shared, then we have to ask ourselves, is this really a homologue? Is this going back to a common ancestor, or rather an analog? So it looks similar, or even a convergence because it arose due to similar selective pressures. So we're basically looking at trees, at phylogenetic trees, and trying to figure out at which point in evolution a certain trait arose. And there are many ways of deconstructing the language faculty. One very prominent one was proposed by Hauser, Fitch, and Chomsky in 2002 in Science. And they distinguished 3 systems. First, the conceptual intentional system, which is important in mapping utterances onto either events or ideas or activities in the environment. So this system is needed to create meaning and is essential for conventionalized symbolic communication, so what language is. Then there is a sensory motor system. In the case of spoken language, this is involved in the production and comprehension of speech patterns. And then we have an abstract linguistic computational system, which is underpinning the compositional nature of language, that we can create infinite meaning from units that we compose in different ways according to certain rules that are immanent to our language systems. So that's the syntax engine. And Hauser, Fitch, and Chomsky proposed that the conceptual intentional system and the sensory motor system are shared with other animals, at least partially shared, while the syntax engine is uniquely human. And I'm going to talk about the following traits today, namely semanticity. So what do calls mean? How much plasticity is there in monkey calls? How much variation do we see between species? And vocal production learning. So how much variation is there in the utterances according to individual social input or auditory input? And then finally, auditory learning. So these aspects that I'm going to talk about today all involve the conceptual intentional system and the sensory motor system. And it's not so easy to attribute with these traits to either of one of the systems. They both play a role in most of the aspects I'm talking about today. And my study systems are African savanna-dwelling monkeys. So savanna monkeys, they belong to the genus Chlorocebus, and baboons, they belong to the genus Papio. And they're interesting because they live in complex groups with differentiated social relationships. So if we are interested in how animals use calls in social context, they're really a really cool system. Also, they make interesting alarm calls, at least the savanna monkeys. And as baboon researchers, we also point out that savanna dwelling is also, of course, interesting if you buy into the idea that humans evolved in a savanna habitat, and so maybe there are some analog or similar selective pressures operating there. Okay, so a little bit of history. Of course, as a biologist, you always have to start with Darwin. And Darwin was really the founding father of many of the ideas that people are discussing when they study animal communication. And his famous tome, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, laid the foundations for evolutionary considerations of animal communication. Another fabulous guy with a beard is Peter Mahler here. He was, he was also extremely influential in our field, and he can be considered like the grandfather, father, or perhaps even great-grandfather by now of many people studying non-human primate communication or bird vocalization. For a time, there was actually only one person in the US, like in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, there was only one professor who was not a student of Peter Mahler in the US, that was Chuck Snowden, and everybody else had studied at one point in their lives with Peter Mahler. And he proposed in 1977 the idea that maybe Darwin did not really capture the full complexity of primate vocalizations. And he was proposing to look at the idea whether there's not just affective and expression of emotion there, but also a symbolic component to their communication. And I think at this point it's important just to briefly clarify, what do I mean when I say affective, or what does it imply when I say it's affective? So affective communication typically can be considered as an evolved response, and it has a very strong innate component. Babies do not need to learn how to cry or to scream or to smile. This develops over time. Surely the smiling at least, the crying not so much. And humans are interesting because at a certain point in life, in their age, they can actually feign emotions, but we don't know that this happens in other animals. Symbolic communication, on the other hand, involves an arbitrary relationship between the signifier and the signified. So I have to learn what something stands for. And we have to learn this collectively, so it's conventionalized. So in a language community, we have to agree how we label what. So this is all learned. And in the case of, say, here, these flags, you need to know which pattern of blue, white, and red signifies France and which one the Netherlands. So you see there is no relationship. It doesn't give you any indication that one or the other flag refers to France or the Netherlands. You just simply have to learn it. And Peter Mahler was interested or intrigued in the idea that there could be more than just affective communication when he learned about the famous vervet monkey alarm calls. I assume that many people will know the story, but perhaps not everyone. So I'm just going to briefly walk you all through it. So these vervet monkeys live in sub-Saharan Africa. They belong to the genus Chlorocebus. And they have three different types of predators to which they have evolved different types of escape responses. So when they see a leopard, they run into a tree. When there's a snake, they stand bipedally, mob the snake. And when there is an eagle, they run into a bush. And they also have evolved three different types of alarm calls. And then the key experiment, the mother of all primate communication papers nowadays, I would say, is the famous study by Seifert, Cheney, and Mahler, where they played back the sounds, the alarm calls, in the absence of any predator, and showed that the monkeys would respond with the appropriate escape response. So playing back a leopard alarm would cause the animals to climb into a tree, and a snake alarm to stand bipedally, and so on and so forth. So that was a major breakthrough and much heralded and made it to the New York Times and so on and so forth. And the initial conclusions were pretty far-reaching. So in the companion paper, the authors wrote, it seems appropriate to conclude that the alarm calls of vervet monkeys designate particular external reference. So that was really a big deal. But then people thought about it more and more. And then by the early 90s, it was clear that there was still, that conclusion wasn't really warranted, but that we were dealing with a situation that was then captured as functionally referential communication. It's not truly referential, but it functions as if it were referential. And the key criteria here are that there is a production specificity. So the calls are only uttered when there is a leopard or only when there is a snake. And response specificity, so the animals in response to the calls show very specific responses. So to look at this a little bit further, given how influential that paper was and cited hundreds of times, it was quite astounding that nobody had ever done a fancy acoustic analysis of the calls, of all the calls available, and done a more elaborate acoustic analysis. And this is what Tabitha Price did for her PhD. She did an analysis of the original recordings by Robert and Dorothy, and also by Tom Strusacker, who was really the pioneer of the vervet monkey vocal communication. And then she added calls that sounded somewhat similar to the alarm calls to see how well these could be distinguished. And what you see here are, first of all, spectrograms again of the calls, so frequency over time, and then the amplitude designating or the darkness designating the distribution of the amplitude in the frequency spectrum. And here are the discriminant functions. And you can see that these groups, the three types of alarm calls for females, are really quite or very well distinguishable. And there's a classification procedure that tells you how well the calls can be distinguished, and it's almost perfect. So female alarm calls can be really very well distinguished, supporting the initial verbal descriptions. However, if you add calls that are given during aggression, the situation becomes a little bit murkier. So then the alarm calls given in response to leopards are still quite distinct. They form a separate cluster. And then we have this banana here of calls given to snakes and eagles, but also during aggression within the group and aggression between the group. So there is more overlap between these multi-element calls here. They form more of a graded continuum compared to the terrestrial alarm barks. And the classification goes down a little bit, but still overall pretty good distinction here. For males, overall, I mean, the calls were not collected systematically, but we infer indirectly from the data availability that they are more likely to call in response to terrestrial predators. There were very few eagle alarms and a few snake alarms, but basically we see the same thing. The calls can be quite well distinguished, a little less well than for females. So there's more overlap here, but still, again, I think it's warranted to say the calls are easily distinguishable. And we didn't have any aggression calls from the East African vervets. So Tabby went to South Africa and she collected calls from males there, and she presented them with leopard models, and then she also collected calls during intergroup aggression. And here you see that the males also bark quite a bit during aggression, and there is overlap here. So there is still the calls, I mean, there are more typical leopard alarm calls and more typical aggression calls, but there's also quite a bit of overlap here where you wouldn't be able, from listening to the call, to decide whether that's a leopard alarm or an aggressive call. So in conclusion, we see that, lo and behold, the alarm calls are acoustically distinguishable, yes. They also elicit more or less specific responses. So they qualify to be categorized as functionally referential signals, according to Macedonia and Evans. But really, if you think about it, that's true for most calls. So most calls have to be distinguishable from other call types. Otherwise, one wouldn't know what kind of signal this is. So a threat grunt has to be acoustically distinct from a contact call to some degree at least. And the listeners must be able to interpret these calls. So we think actually that functionally referential signal is not a concept that helps you to understand communication better. And it is to some degree misleading, because people then drop the functionally from their thinking and think that if they find context specificity, that this implies there is referential signaling, which is not the case. And if anyone who's interested in this problem here, I recommend this paper that Brandon Wheeler and I wrote about the problem with this concept of referential signaling. What we really don't understand so far is the link between the mental representation, the affective state or eternal state, or the evaluation of what's going on, and the vocal behavior. And here's the problem. So if we if you remember what I just said about the calls. So we have some calls that are given when there is an aerial predator or during aggression. Then there are calls that are given in response to a snake or when there is intergroup aggression. Or then there are calls that are given in response to a leopard or during other types of aggression. So I have no doubt that the animals are able to distinguish between these two situations. They would be clearly able to distinguish a different group from an eagle or from a snake. So there is something in their head that represents these different situations. But how do we end up in a situation where they produce similar sounding calls? And one idea could be that seeing an eagle or having a fight within the group elicits an internal state that is similar. So a certain degree of aversion is activated. And then this aversion activates the pattern generator that gives rise to the Raup call. So that's the eagle alarm call, or this type of call they're making. And then if there is a snake, that's similar to seeing a group in the distance. So it's like more like a mobbing call, actually. And so the internal state is mobbing, and that gives rise to chutters. We don't know if that's the case. An alternative view could be that you have an internal, that these different situations evoke different internal states. And the animals evaluate these situations differently, but then ultimately these different internal states or evaluations converge on the same pattern generators. So it could be that they actually have different feelings, if you will, or different evaluations of the situations, but because there are only so few different patterns available to them, this converges on the same pattern generators. And so that's why we have this link, that they produce similar sounding calls and actually quite different situations. And we don't know. And I hope that people will be able to clarify this. What we know so far about the neural control over vocalizations comes mostly from work in macaques and squirrel monkeys. So Uwe Jürgens has been really influential, and Steffen Hage is also quite active. And Steffen, together with Andreas Nieder, they wrote this nice summary article here, but there are several others around. And they basically review this dual network model of control that monkeys have over their vocalizations. There is a primary vocal motor network where you have the anterior cingulate cortex here, which serves as basically a control site for this key. It's a relay station. So the periaqueductal gray is a relay station that gets input from different sources, including the amygdala. And then this projects ultimately onto pattern generators in the lower brainstem. And then we have a cortical system here. This is the volitional articulatory motor network that also is located in areas homolog to the Broca area, which feeds into the anterior cingulate cortex. So this is where calls can be initiated voluntarily. And then there are also some projections down to the brainstem here. And overall, this is consistent with the evidence that we have that monkeys are able to voluntarily initiate vocalizations, but they have very little vocal control over the actual structure. So they would not be able to produce voluntarily a certain, say, upsweep of the call or downsweep of the call. But what they can do is they can trigger, to some degree at least, or control the utterance, whether they make a coo call or a gruff, for instance. And there's really fabulous work by Steffen Hage, where he trained 2 monkeys to produce vocalizations on command. And when they were still young, one of the monkeys was actually able to switch between 2 call types. But interestingly, both lost this ability when they got older. So when they were adult, they couldn't do it anymore. They were still opening the mouth, going like, but nothing happened. And in humans, we have this additional direct projection from the motor cortex to the muscles that innervate our voice box. And then we have this elaborate ability to control our breathing, the articulation, and the voicing, which is necessary for speech. So we see at the neural level, we do understand, we have a good understanding or some ideas how the neural control works for monkey vocalizations. But we have a less understanding about how the environment and the perception of the environment and the evaluation of certain situations then feeds onto calling. So this is what I just said. We also know that affective states are tied to broad classes of calls. That was work by Uwe Jürgens, where he stimulated certain areas in the brain, and he could show that the animals either sought to repeat the stimulation. So that was when they liked this kind of stimulation, or they could avoid the stimulation. And so whenever he, whenever he stimulated these certain areas, then they would produce a range of calls, not just one call. So it's not a deterministic system, it's entirely probabilistic. But what is also clear, I hope, from everything I've said so far is there is no space for arbitrary communication here. There is no capacity for conventionalized communication. There is too much of a tie between a certain affective, broad affective state and the vocal behavior, and too little volitional control over the voicing. Okay, so far so good. So far about semanticity, so broadly emotional, but not really fully understood. But how much plasticity is there? This is also something people haven't really looked at much in the past, only maybe in the last decade or so. And of course, we were really interested to see how does the vervet monkey, or how does their alarm call system compare to other members of the same genus. And the genus Chlorocebus is interesting. We have 6 different species here, all over sub-Saharan Africa. The monkeys that have been studied in great detail live in Kenya. And then Tabby also studied members of the same species down here in South Africa. And we studied the West African members of this genus, the Chlorocebus sabaeus. They're the sister group to all the other members of the genus. And it depends on which author you consult. These authors here, Dolotovskaya and colleagues, determined the split for this species with the other species to about 3.5 million years ago. Other authors say, well, it was maybe 1.2 million, so it's not quite clear. But what we can say is sometimes happened or has passed since the split between these 2 species here, despite the fact that they look quite similar. So to study the alarm calls of the West African green monkeys, Tabitha manufactured these wonderful models here. So this is here a leopard model, and this is a snake model. They both look very convincing. And here is a paper mache eagle, and that doesn't look so convincing. And the monkeys also thought that this doesn't look so convincing. So they produced whole lots of alarm calls to the leopard model and to the snake model, but just remained silent in response to the eagle. So we were not able to look at the eagle alarm calls in the initial analysis. So then we thought, well, why don't they give alarm calls to any of the aerial predators there, to the birds of prey around? What if we present them with something in the air they have never seen before? Would they then produce an alarm call? And if so, which kind of alarm call? Would they make an alarm call that sounds like the East African vervet alarm calls, or would they make an alarm call that sounds completely different, or novel, or how much plasticity is there if you present them with something new? So to our great joy, and this is the study by Franziska Wegdell, the animals did produce calls in response to the drone, and then we could analyze everything and compare it. And here are just the spectrograms. So on top, West Africa, below East Africa. Aerial would be the drone for the West Africans, and eagle for the East Africans. And what you see here in the spectrogram, that these calls look similar, they also sound similar, and if you do an acoustic analysis, they are similar. So there's really very little change. Aerial alarm, this seems to be hardwired. And we see a little bit more variation in the leopard alarms, but the snake's alarms are also quite similar. So despite something between 1.2 and 3.5 million years of evolution, hardly anything has changed in the utterances, in the structure of the calls that the animals are making. And the same thing holds for males. Overall, the broad category of calls they're making when they're faced with these predators is highly similar. So from this, we can conclude that the structure of the calls is highly conserved, and also the stimulus call link is conserved. So what kind of call they make, they don't have to learn this. This is an innate disposition to produce a certain type of call in response to something in the air, not arbitrary. There is no freedom to choose which call you make in response to what. But learning shapes the categorization of objects and events. And we actually knew this since 1980, since the 1980 paper, but it was somehow forgotten in the literature, really, that here the infants below you see to which kind of stimuli infant vervets give eagle alarms, and there's a whole array here, and they don't have to learn it. And then the juveniles become a little bit more selective, and then the adults, they mainly give eagle alarms to martial eagles. So there's a process going on, but the initial disposition is if there's something in the air, you make an eagle alarm. And then you learn when to make an eagle alarm as you grow older. Baboons may also have something to contribute to this question. How much variation is there between species? Similar to the savanna monkeys, baboons also occur all over sub-Saharan Africa and also on the Arabian Peninsula here. And baboons are a really cool study system because they come in two different types of societies. So these four species here, olive baboons, echidna, and chacma, and yellow baboons, they live in female philopatric systems where the females stay in the group and the males disperse. Groups are more or less stable. And in contrast, the Hamadryas baboon and the Guinea baboon live in multi-level systems where the core unit is an association between a male and several females and the young. And then several of these units team up at the second level in the Guinea baboons, we call them parties. And then several parties team up, or two parties or three team up to be a gang in the Guinea baboons. We know this because we happen to be the only group that studies Guinea baboons in the wild and has clarified their social system over the last years, and we're still working on this. So really cool to see how maybe does the communication change between different types of societies. And unfortunately, there is really little variation. So despite the high plasticity in terms of social disposition, so chacma baboons are very aggressive and nasty, and Guinea baboons are just cool and friendly and easy and tolerant. The structure of the call does not vary a lot. Yeah, so there are some species differences. So here the papio, the olive baboons, they tend to make the second syllable here. But overall, I mean, the structure of the barks in different baboon species doesn't vary much. And if you look at the structure of the repertoires of the two species where we had most of the data, namely Guinea baboons on the left and chacma baboons on the right, you even see that the structure of the repertoire is very similar with grunts and barks and screams as the major component. Again here, barks, grunts, barks, and screams. So really, very, very little variation. Again, we're talking about 2 million years of evolution that passed, and these guys are stuck with these patterns. So, and you can look at chimpanzees. They make pant hoots and food grunts and hoot calls, or you can go to Asia, leaf monkeys, gibbons. We see this over and over, this pattern that at the level of the genus, it's a highly conserved pattern. Yet, there still may be a little bit of wriggle room here for vocal production learning. So maybe there is some aspect there. And again, we're looking here now at the Guinea baboons, at the grunts of the male Guinea baboons. We were very interested whether we would see any convergence, vocal convergence at the level of the males that hang out with one another. As I just told you, the Guinea baboons live in a multi-level society where we have parties composed of something between 5 and 9 different individuals. And then these parties team up to gangs. And what we did is we looked at the variation between and within parties and between and within gangs. And we were able to control for genetic relatedness here. As I said, the males are philopatric. We have genotyped everybody, so we could look at average relatedness for the males. And we had 27 males in the analysis. And what we did find was that the grunts within gangs here on the left side and within parties are more similar than between parties or between gangs. But the effect sizes are tiny. So yes, there's a significant effect, but it's not strong. Yeah, it's really very, very small. Now, we didn't know at that point of the analysis whether that was due to genetic variation. So perhaps this is also because they're more genetically related, just to confirm that for our study subject, that was the case. Yes, males within the same gang were more highly related and within the same party were more highly related. So this could tell us that maybe this is a genetic effect actually. But when we looked at the animals that were either highly related here, so they were in the top quartile of relatedness, certainly something like cousins or half-brothers or something, compared to the animals that were certainly not related, then we found no effect of relatedness on acoustic similarity. So we think it has nothing to do with genetic relatedness. It really has something to do with being in the same group, because some of the males in your group may actually not be highly related. So having then, and you can still have higher acoustic similarity with these guys. So social level, not genetic relatedness, correlates with acoustic similarity, but the effects are quite small. So in conclusion, the structure of calls is highly conserved. The scope of the acoustic variation is limited. And I think this is similar to what we see also in other species. So there's a paper on Campbell monkey contact calls or chimpanzee food grunts, where authors have reported variation or convergence within groups or in response to groups being put together. But it's all within basically the species-specific constraints. So they produce food grunts, and then the food grunts change a little bit in quality. It's not as if they were learning new words or anything. And so people have been butting heads quite a bit about this. Do non-human primates show vocal learning now or not? Because on one hand, we have the constraint situation. On the other hand, we have evidence for some variation. And we try to overcome this dichotomous view of vocal learning, and we're not alone. There is a whole range of papers that have come out in recent years that argue we really have to acknowledge that there may be different routes for vocal convergence or vocal learning. Martins and Bucks is just another example, but there are more papers. And in the present paper that we put on bioRxiv about the Guinea baboon grunts, we propose that it might be a useful or good idea to distinguish between explicit and implicit vocal production learning. And implicit learning can be viewed as a byproduct of more general learning mechanisms. So in this case here, vocal convergence may be a result of auditory priming. So just simply by being exposed to a certain acoustic quality around me activates the patterns that represent basically these variants and makes it more likely that I choose them or that they're activated actually to when you vocalize. So this is implicit. It can be completely beyond. It doesn't have to be volitional. It's a byproduct simply of your auditory environment. And this is different from explicit learning, which underpins word learning. Word learning is tied to a goal. You have the goal to express something and the intention to inform. And word learning, therefore, involves not only copying an acoustic pattern, but also understanding what this is about and having a communicative intent. So word learning goes far beyond acoustic copying. And in the baboons or in the non-human primates, I would even doubt whether it's actually copying, or rather a byproduct of sensory motor integration in the broad sense. So in conclusion, I would say, yes, there is a big gap between non-human primates and humans. We have some form of vocal learning in non-human primates, but I think, or I would say, that it's quite different from what we see in humans. So the final stretch, auditory learning. So we've now so far talked about the limits, about a limited system, highly constrained, very little flexibility in vocal production. But what's happening on the other side? Yeah. And here's one example that shows you that the recipients, the listeners, are really cool and fast and intelligent, and they make up perhaps for some of the constraint on the side of the senders. And we know that comprehension learning is very important, not only in the species-specific communication, but it's probably useful to understand, all sorts of sounds in the environment, and it's not restricted to primates. So here is Rico, the wonder dog, who knew then more than 200 labels for his toys, for his 200 toys that he had. And for non-human primates, there's actually an interesting question. People have tried to study auditory learning in the lab, and that's something for masochists. Yeah, so if you do an auditory discrimination task in the lab, have fun. It will take thousands and thousands and thousands of trials until the animals perhaps understand what you want from them, and it's very difficult to study in the wild, because typically, of course, the infants are exposed to their species-specific sounds a lot. So what we did after Franzi had flown the drone over the green monkeys, we played back the drone sound. We did not play back the alarm calls to the drone sound, but we played back the drone sound after minimal exposure. So the first time we did these trials when they had only seen the drone once. And then next day or 2 days later, Franzi plays the speaker and she played back the drone sound and then checked what happened. And we found that the monkeys were more vigilant and looked up more frequently after the playback of the drone sound compared to control sound, if you will, after a single exposure, at least some of them, or after twice or 3 times exposure. So they are able to do super rapid auditory learning. And from the listener's perspective, the source of the acoustic variation is absolutely not important. It can be affect-based, it can be innate, it can be artificial, as long as it allows you to predict that something's going on in your environment, what might be important to you. And what's also clear is that the responses are not deterministic. So the monkeys have the acoustic information and they have additional information, who's calling, what's the context. They factor all of this in when they make the decision to how to respond. And this is like almost this last slide. So this is a study also by Tabitha, where she presented the West African green monkeys with contextual information. So she either showed them a snake before, half an hour before she did these experiments, the playbacks, or she showed them a leopard model before, or she had nothing before. And then she played either a snake call or a leopard call. And this is how often the monkeys jumped into a tree, and they were across the board, irrespective of what happened before, more likely to jump into a tree after a leopard call than after a snake call. So here the acoustic variation in the call is decisive. But if she looked at how long they were then staying in a tree, you could see that it was an additional effect of the context. So when they had seen the leopard before and heard the leopard alarm call later, they were much more likely to stay in a tree for a long time. So here you can see that the information retrieved from the acoustic structure from the call affects the immediate response and the context later decision-making. Okay, in summary. So yes, there is semanticity in monkey calls, and I would also say this holds for apes, but we're dealing with evolved or innate patterns. There is some plasticity, but it's very constrained in the vocal production. Vocal production learning is limited and most likely implicit. In contrast, auditory learning is rapid and open-ended. So at the site of call production, there is a major gap between non-human primates and humans. And I would put the radical changes, much later on the time scale, certainly after the split between the last common ancestors between chimpanzees and bonobos on the one hand and us on the other, more probably, a few 100,000 years ago. And the crucial changes must have involved motor control, so the reorganization of the brain, and social cognition and understanding of others, people's knowledge states, and so on. Call comprehension and the inferential machine is most likely not the bottleneck. So to come back to my initial question, what do studies of non-human primate vocal communication reveal about the evolution of speech? I would say perhaps less than we had hoped. But if you're interested in this, I would advise you to study genes and brains. Probably you find the answer there, not in the calls of the monkeys. But the good news is that we learned quite a bit about non-human primate vocal communication. We understand better how the system works. If we hadn't had this motivation, we would still be much in the dark. But nevertheless, this prompted me to take a broader view and really start a more integrative research program in which I look at how social behavior, communication, and cognition evolve in concert. And if you want to know more, perhaps you want to check out that book, Monkey Talk. And for now, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the question and the discussion.
Thank you, Julia, for this amazing talk. We have a couple of questions that came from the audience. So the first is there a difference in the general call frequency between males and females in vervet monkeys?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, and this is, if I had only more time. Yeah, because we had focused so much on the language-like components of their communication, many people have overlooked actually some things that behavioral ecologists would ask, like sexual selection. So which of the calls are different between the sexes? And yes, the males, their barks are much more, well, they could also be viewed as sexually selected signals because they give you information about the male stamina. Yeah. Okay. So yes, there are differences between males and females that go beyond simple size differences.
So yeah, the second question is on the same line a bit. Is there an asymmetry in learning between male and female baboons also in the vocal learning task? In the data that you showed, this was male baboons or female baboons?
So the auditory learning was...
the vocal learning.
Oh, the vocal learning. We only looked at males so far. Okay. We haven't looked at females. So I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. And the other thing for the response to the drone experiment. So they don't have to infer that the thing flying is an agent, right? You think that they don't need metacognition or something to... Okay. Good. So can you speculate on why the scope of acoustic variation is limited, evolutionary wise? Is it...
Why? Well, why? I don't know why. Yeah. I think it must have something to do that, say, the genetic networks must be so highly conserved because probably every mutant or some of the mutants that would be necessary would be so deleterious that there is a strong selection on keeping the system intact.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's my idea. And if you look at, for instance, the famous FOXP2 gene that was initially believed to be a grammar gene, it's not, it's a transcription factor. but nevertheless, it's involved in a few of the aspects that, are important for language. It's highly conserved. There are only like 3 base pairs changed in 70 million years of evolution. So some of these circuits seem to be hard to change. Yeah. And only a very few variants are actually possible. And I assume that is true for probably another of, but I'm not a geneticist. I haven't studied genomic variation. But I think that's my assumption at the moment, that's one of the reasons.
Great. So the other one is that it's surprising that the social context seems not to affect, or social cognition seems not to affect like vocal learning. Do you think social cognition, as you alluded, got involved later in evolution? So this
like
social cognition, like, the social cognition interact with vocal networks. Like, it seems what you are proposing that it happened later in evolution, not earlier.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the social cognition of the baboons and also the vertebrates, it's very elaborate when you look at social observations, social knowledge, in the sense of they know exactly who's related to whom, who's doing what to whom, who's friends, foes, rank, everything. They know everything about each other. They are watching each other all the time. And there is certainly a tie between use of calls to achieve something. So if I want to influence my environment, that's what they're good at. But there is no good evidence, or from the monkeys, there's really no evidence at all that they know, for instance, that somebody doesn't know that there's a danger later there. So they don't go like, here behind you is actually a so-and-so, or watch it. So the alarm call systems are, they're there, but they don't take into account the knowledge states of the others.
Okay. So you mentioned that communication seems not to be arbitrary. How would you exactly define arbitrariness in animal communication?
Well, I wouldn't know of an example where any animal created a symbol. They can deal with symbols. You can train them. So in the language, the ape language projects, they all trained the apes to use either signed language or symbol plates or something to express themselves. So they can learn this, but there is no evidence that anybody ever came up with something completely novel that was then shared and then used in the community. So it's a symbol production that appears to be, unique to our own species.
Great. So many questions. Another one, are there developmental studies of vocal production in any primates with comparison to the classic human pattern of cooings and babblings and one-word stages?
Yeah. So I think the majority of studies, we looked at baboons, of course. So there is no babbling stage there. You see that most of the important calls are there in the infant version. Simply there's just, the infants are smaller, so the scream is different, but that's all attributable to size. There is some babbling reportedly in marmosets. So that they're highly voluble New World monkeys, and there seems to be a stage where they produce calls, and it has been suggested that this is a form of babbling, but it's a bit of a contentious issue. Some other people would say, well, it's not really babbling. They're just, highly vocal, and they continue to be highly vocal, and they still make some of these calls later in life, depending on the context. So that is, I think, the typical example that comes up, that marmosets have some form of babbling, but it's not canonical. It's not that infant babbling really has a different structure. So human infants, they would go, they have these typical syllable duplication, and so it's a bit different.
Would you say that monkeys exhibit syntax in their call composition as do birds and bats and possibly some other species?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between phonological syntax. So is there some order in the elements? Yes, that depends on the species, especially gibbons, for instance, they have phonological syntax, but it's not a syntax that is compositional in nature. It's not that they create new meaning. There's no rule system that uses the elements and aligns them in different order, and in this way creates a new meaning. So I would say, no, they really do not have a syntax engine. And then there's this work by Fischer and Hauser and some other people. So again, yes, they can process sequential information, but they would also probably struggle with any higher order system or, sequences.
Great. So what's your thoughts on the hypothesis that relates certain facial expressions, for example, lip smacking in non-human primates or apes, with language evolution?
It could be, that these circuits were actually co-opted. Yeah, so that you have a basic pattern generator that gives rise to the mouth moving in rhythmic fashion. And then when people started to talk, that was, that these circuits were utilized. So yeah, could be, but it's not so. It's maybe necessary, but certainly not sufficient.
So you have mentioned and didn't elaborate more about the referential signaling of communications, and it can be misleading. Can you a bit elaborate how to know it or why it can be misleading?
Well, I mean, the question is, does the framework of referential communication explain more than a more general account of how signals work? And if you think about Maynard Smith's work, for instance, about the evolution of animal signals, then that tells you that signals evolved because they affect the recipient. For them to be effective, they need to be distinguishable from other signals. Yeah. So you have this link in the evolution of communication. It's always a co-evolution of the sender, the signaling, and the responses. So signals would not evolve if they didn't have an effect on anybody. Yeah? So you have an evolved signal, like, for instance, the lip smacking as an example, because that signals benign intent and maybe a friendly disposition. And that only works because somebody is responding also in a friendly manner. Yeah. So for every signal that you look at that are signals, I mean, I'm not talking about antlers or red chest patches, but signals that are results of direct motor patterns. So vocal communication, facial expression, perhaps some body postures. They must have a certain specificity, and there is also, on the other hand, a certain specific response. Otherwise, the signal would be, it would just be noise, and there would be no evolution of this thing, of this combination. Yeah. So we don't think it provides additional, the concept of referential signaling provides additional explanatory power compared to a general framework of the evolution of signals. But it has the danger that people continually, misconceive it as evidence for words.
Yes.
So if you look sort of, at the pros and cons, or so I think it was very useful. It got us thinking about the system a lot. But if you really think it through, then I think you end up that everything is referential or nothing, then it doesn't explain more than a broader account would.
So the last question, which, to be my question, is like talking at the end as your the broader view, your last slide. So your plan would be like to study vocalization communication, but also looking at the social behavior at the same time, right? That's what I understood, that this should, we should adopt this broader view in order to better explain vocal communication. That's your view how to, as a research program, like this would be better to do with primates?
Well, not better, but I think highly informative. I think there are still many unexplored questions regarding the adaptive value of certain ways of signaling, the function. Again, we don't understand the mechanism. So basically, taking a Tinbergian perspective, looking at the evolution, the phylogeny, the function, and the mechanism, ontogeny, would be, there's still much there beyond looking at whether or not it's similar or different from language. Yeah. Great. And I'm really interested in so if you look at this situation here with the guinea baboons, yeah. So she's signaling to him, what is he inferring from this signaling? How is he regulating a response? What is he garnering? So he's watching this whole thing. What is he inferring from their interaction? And then comparing this between different baboon species. That's what we're doing now. So we're looking at the hippie baboons, the guinea baboons in West Africa, but we're also getting information from other baboon species, the chacmas, for instance. And you see there what is amenable to change, and where are things constant. And so getting sort of a broader idea about the evolution of these three traits in concert.
Great. That's a nice end for the talk today. So thank you, Julia, for showing up today to our talk. And our next talk will be on November 4th. It will be Eugenia Chiappé. She is at the Champollion, and please be there. It will be also at noon, Wednesday, November 4th. Thank you, Julia, again. And
thank you all.
Have a great